time to turn off your phones or put them on silent mode. Okay, I'm going to get ready to get started. All right, welcome everyone. My name is Matt Pinsker. I'm the director of the House Divided Project. We're the host of the event this evening. This is the annual Wert Lecture. I'll describe the lecture in a minute, but first let me just introduce you to the House Divided Project in case you're not aware. We're a faculty-student initiative on campus that's devoted to building resources for K-12 classrooms about the Civil War era. We run a whole variety of programs, and we rely heavily on a lot of student work. I want to begin tonight by thanking our interns. We have 3 of them who've done an awful lot this year and in the past to help everything that we do become a success. So I'd like to acknowledge them and have them stand. It's Henry Booth, Sarah Mash, and Etsub Tay. Let's give them a round of applause. I can testify they're very hardworking. I also want to thank a group of people who represent one of our most successful programs. We run a summer seminar for high school students that's been in place now for 5 years, and with the expectation now that it'll continue for another several years. It's designed for low-income or first-generation college students, but it's open to anyone, and it's a rigorous college-level program in history where the students kind of get a boot camp experience to show them what college is like and to prepare them for the admissions process. It's funded by the Teagle Foundation in New York. It's called the Knowledge for Freedom Seminar. We always invite veterans of the program back for this annual lecture. A number of them are here tonight. I'd like all of the people who've participated in the Knowledge for Freedom program to stand, and let's give them a round of applause as well. Now, tonight's program is the annual Wert Lecture. That's a partnership that we run with Craig Kaba, who's a local educator and curator. He owns the collection that was put together by J. Howard Wert in the years after the Civil War. The Wert family was very prominent in Adams County. They collected artifacts from across American history. They did a especially good job of collecting artifacts from the Civil War and at Gettysburg, the battle and the address. The Wert collection is probably the finest collection of private artifacts, privately held artifacts in America related to the Civil War. Of course, one of the most prominent of these artifacts is the lectern that was on the platform at the Gettysburg Address that you see before you. The speaker's platform, this is the photograph that shows the platform. You can see Lincoln hatless near the center. It was chaotic. You can't see the lectern in the photograph. We don't have a photograph of the lectern. But J. Howard Wert was there, and in his notes he wrote that this was the lectern borrowed from a professor at Gettysburg College, which all the speakers at Gettysburg used that day. Now, Lincoln only had 2 sheets of paper. I don't know how much of a lectern he needed. But the main orator, Edward Everett, had a printed version of his 2-hour speech. He needed this lectern. And so I just want to remind you, for those of you who are here today, if you want to see the lectern and take a picture in front of it afterwards, Henry will help you, our intern, but please, don't touch the lectern. Don't knock the lectern, and don't stand behind it. Everybody stands in front of it. We need to preserve this piece of history. As well as the other artifacts that are downstairs in the lobby, in this case connected to the topic of tonight's speech. They feature the story, the life and career of Thaddeus Stevens, arguably the most important congressman in the 19th century, if not all of American history. So if you didn't see the artifacts that are on display in the lobby, courtesy of Craig Kaba, then please do so afterwards. Craig has been an enormous friend of the House Divided Project, and his preservation efforts on behalf of the Civil War are legendary. So let's give him a round of applause and gratitude. Thank you. And now to the main event. We each year try to bring a prominent Civil War era historian to come and speak near the lectern and talk about an important issue from the Civil War era. This year we invited Fergus Bordewich. He is an old friend of the school and our program. I've known Fergus for years. He's one of the finest writers in the field. He's written a number of books. His most recent book is on sale downstairs. It's called The Klan War. It's about Reconstruction era politics. By the way, Jim Schmick, the bookseller, wants me to remind you. Sorry to intrude on your introduction, but he does accept credit cards. All right, so in case you want to buy The Klan War or the book that Fergus is going to be talking about tonight, Congress at War, they'll all be on sale, and Fergus will be available afterwards to sign them. So please consider that after the lecture. But Fergus has done an amazing body of work on a number of subjects. The time that we first met years ago on campus here was when he was working on a very important book about the Underground Railroad called Bound for Canaan. If you haven't read that book, it's one of the finest narrative histories of the Underground Railroad. Congress at War, his subject today, is going to be a talk about how the Civil War Congress remade modern America, how it set the template for many of the changes that would happen in the post-Civil War era. It's a fascinating but kind of overlooked subject. You know, I could speak to this as a Lincoln scholar. Lincoln is the person that everybody asks about and talks about in American politics during the Civil War, but obviously he didn't do any of it alone. It took an enormous body of effort and hard work from leading figures like Thaddeus Stevens on Capitol Hill to make the Civil War a success and to set the blueprint for modern America thereafter. So let's hear about this from the expert. Fergus Bordewich, please give him a warm welcome, and let's enjoy our talk with him this evening.
Hi, everybody. Well, first, I want to thank Professor Matt Pinsker, and I want to thank the President's Office of Dickinson College for making it possible for me to be here, and as well as to thank all of you. It's great to see so many students, as well as some old friends. I want to start by just giving you a little context. Maybe I should say parenthetically, I'm going to try to give you 4 years of political history in 45 minutes. So I'll do my best. There's more than I can possibly address in a short talk of this kind. But what I hope to do, I think, is to persuade you, or at least encourage you to think that what was happening in Congress was at least as important and arguably as dramatic as what was happening in the battlefields of the Civil War. And that, as Matt briefly said, typically when we talk about Civil War politics, we talk about Abraham Lincoln. And I don't need to explain why we do that. But partly, I think, it's because in the 20th century, we've come to think of the presidency as the main locus of power, the main base of power in the federal government. That was not so in the 19th century. Congress, the two houses of Congress, were the main base of power in the federal government. There was obviously a lot of tension over that with Lincoln. I'm not going to talk much, possibly even at all, about Lincoln here. But first, let me give you Just very briefly, a sense of the mood in Washington. This is, as you can see, Fort Sumter. In 1861, when secession was imminent, and that imminence lasted for several months, the city felt like a mausoleum. I'm quoting Verena Davis, by the way. Said the city felt like some kind of mausoleum with nobody visiting, no dinners or parties, just a sullen gloom impending over everything. And a congressman from Ohio, it's Clement Vallandigham. Some of you will know who I'm talking about here. Yes, the arch copperhead who figures fairly prominently as a counterexample in the book Congress at War. But nonetheless, he wrote to his wife in 1861, "I am able to do no good here, no man can. So I sit, and I'm obliged to sit, quiet and sorrowful, condemned as one who watches over the couch of a loved mother slowly dying with consumption, to see my country perish by inches." And Americans who took the country's immortality for granted knew, everyone knew, that things would never be the same again. And gloom shaded inexorably into a universal fear that things politically were spinning out of control, that no one was in control. And worrying rumors flew through the air that the Capitol would be attacked by a Virginia mob, that a coup d'etat would come any day, that unexplained fires around the city were part of a terrorist plot. And congressmen and anyone who could afford to do so dispatched their wives and children to Philadelphia or New York for safety. And bear in mind, I'm sure that virtually everybody who's sitting in this room has some sense of how many soldiers were mobilized to fight the Civil War. In 1861, the size of the United States Army is 16,367. And hardly any of them were even east of the Mississippi River. And in fact, Washington was pretty close to defenseless. And most of the soldiers who were east of the Mississippi were in the seceding states. Anyway, there's a lot more to be said about that, but I just want you to have a feeling for for the tremendous anxiety that Americans, particularly political Americans there in Washington, felt. And fortunately, as we all know, troops were dispatched rapidly, just barely enough to provide a defensive force in the city. And this looks like a battle taking place, actually. And you see the U.S. Capitol in the background on the right. There was no battle there. These are actually Massachusetts troops, as I recollect, Massachusetts, just training by running up a hill in the District of Columbia. But almost nobody had fought a war since the Mexican War. Almost nobody knew how to do it. Almost none of these men had ever fired a gun in anger. But at any rate, I'm going to talk to you almost entirely about Congress. And I'm talking about two Congresses, the 37th and the 38th. And I would argue, and I think it's not very hard to make the case, that these, I speak of the Civil War Congress, I'm really talking about two here, were among the handful of most effective Congresses ever in American history, a few others being the first Congress, Roosevelt's New Deal Congresses, and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society Congress. A Republican who was very active, a radical Republican at the time, Albert Riddle, wrote, "We were elected to do anything, everything, except what fell to us to do, fight the greatest civil war of history. It came upon us as an utter surprise." The men who were coming into office, members of Congress, did not know that they were going to be responsible for fighting the greatest war ever fought on North American soil. Congress faced a multitude of challenges. How could the North be mobilized for a war of unimaginable magnitude? And was Congress or the president responsible for leading the war effort? Could the Republicans, who were completely untried, bear in mind, this is the first Republican administration in American history, could they even manage to govern? Would the war be fought with respect for the sanctity of slavery or not? Or with a ruthlessness that would bring the seceded states to their knees as quickly as possible? Could the Constitution survive the suspension of civil rights in the name of national security? How would the war be paid for? Nobody knew. Nobody knew. It wasn't for free. It wasn't for free. It cost a humongous amount of money. Nobody knew where the money was going to come from. Would the financial burden break the Northern economy? What should white Americans do about slavery, if anything? Could Republicans prevent their party from splitting between anti-slavery radicals and those who were willing to tolerate slavery as long as it was contained in the South? Plenty of Unionists, especially in the border states, but not only, regarded any tampering with slavery as a threat to basic property rights. Representative John Crisfield, he was a pro-slavery Unionist from Maryland, said, "If you take from us today our right to hold slaves, how long will it be before you will take from us some other constitutional right?" So all these things that I just skimmed over are topics of intense, I think I've got, topics of intense debate in Congress. This is one of the very, very few images of any kind, there are no photographs, of Congress actually in debate in the mid-19th century. I mean, this has been copied, it was copied for over about 20 years for different Congresses, but I like to think personally that this gentleman with his hand in the air on the left side is Thaddeus Stevens, but I don't know. Maybe not. It may be a little too vigorous for that. But at any rate, with the Southerners gone, all Southerners have left Congress. So Republicans hold decisive majorities in both houses of Congress. This, by the way, in common with the several other extremely effective Congresses that I mentioned, was this effective because one party had a huge majority, and they could essentially do what they wanted. That didn't mean at all that everybody was of one mind. But about a third of the seats in Congress were empty. The Republicans, led mainly, not exclusively, but mainly by Thaddeus Stevens and a few other men whose names I'll at least mention, began an era of legislative activism that was going to change American society beyond recognition. During the next 4 years, Congress would help win the war, craft the peace, reinvent the nation's financial system, and enact a raft of forward-looking legislation that pointed the way toward the strong, activist national government that eventually came into being in the 20th century. That was not a characteristic of 19th century American government. And it would change the political, social, and even the physical landscape of the United States. And for the first time, it would ensure the protection of civil rights as the responsibility of the federal government, or would begin to do so at any rate. The wartime Congresses were incredibly productive. They raised hundreds of thousands of troops for the Union, instituted the nation's first military draft, and pushed very hard against Abraham Lincoln for more aggressive generals and a more vigorous strategy against the South. Of course, the generals that they wanted weren't always better generals, but that's, as we know, but that's something else. And in providing financing for the war, Congress created the country's first national currency, the forerunner of the IRS, and the foundation of the Federal Reserve System. And long before Lincoln became willing to contemplate the emancipation of slaves, members of Congress, led by Stevens, demanded it, enacting laws that turned abolitionism from a fringe belief into public policy, culminating in the 13th Amendment and pointing the way towards the 14th and 15th Amendments. Let me go back to this last image because I like it. I want you to at least have it in your mind. And here, the Capitol Dome was under construction at the beginning of the war and well into the war. And as an image, as an icon, if you like, of the incomplete union, the fractured, broken union, it's perfect. It's perfect. Construction continued. To Lincoln's credit, he said, please finish it. Congress, of course, wished that as well. And as a symbol of the a fractured country, it's unmatched, I think. So I gave you a quick list, an overview of some of the watershed achievements of the Civil War Congress. I want to quickly talk about four, which rarely are even factored in as war measures. But they would not have occurred were it not, one, for the war, and second, for the huge Republican majority in Congress, led by radical Republicans, more progressive-minded, forward-looking Republicans. And they're among the most transformative measures that ever appeared on the floor of Congress. The Homestead Act, the Pacific Railroad Act, the Morrill Land Grant College Act, and the creation of the Department of Agriculture. All these had been dammed up for years, and even decades in some cases, by implacable opposition from the slaveholding South. On the face of it, maybe this doesn't sound like very sexy stuff to you, okay? But these are transformative pieces of legislation. They're taking place simultaneously with the war being fought on battlefields. And they're part and parcel of how Republicans in Congress saw the war effort. These were seen as war measures. The Homestead Bill promised 160 acres of free land in the West to any head of family who was 21 years and a loyal citizen and lived on the land for 5 years, and improved it by clearing it and erecting a home. Union soldiers who served at least 2 years would receive title after just a single year on the land. Wasn't there a consensus about this? Didn't this sound like a great idea for everybody, except Native Americans, obviously? But the South had ferociously opposed homestead measures before the war. Why? Because they feared, quite rightly, by the way, that it would lead to the formation of more free states who were hostile to slavery. And typically in 1860, the extreme Southern nationalist Senator Louis Wigfall, I could digress and talk to you for an hour about Wigfall, who is quite a character, but I won't, protested, he was from Texas, protested that a homestead bill for, quote, providing land for the landless, homes for the homeless, left out the important matter, in his opinion, of, quote, of slaves for the slaveless. That was the nature of debate over homesteading before the Republicans won a majority. So the Homestead Bill was introduced in February by the House Speaker, who was by no means the most powerful figure in Congress. That was Thaddeus Stevens. The configuration of power in the Houses was rather different than it is today. Anyway, it was Galusha Grow of Pennsylvania. I believe he represented Erie, unless I'm mistaken, up in that vicinity. And I'm going to quote him because this statement is quite fine. Reuniting the country and settling the West, he said, represented two linked fronts in a single epic struggle. He declared, he framed the bill as both a war measure and a soaring vision of post-war manifest destiny that would reward, and now I'm going to quote, that would reward the soldier now in the field fighting the battles of constitutional free government, along with the soldiers of peace that grand army of the sons of toil, whose lives from the cradle to the grave are a constant warfare with the elements, with the unrelenting obstacles of nature and the merciless barbarities of savage life. Their battlefields are the prairies and the wilderness of your frontiers. Their achievements, felling the forests, leveling the mountains, filling the valleys, and smoothing the pathway of science and civilization in their march over the continent. Homesteading, he said, would usher in an era of unparalleled prosperity. The greater the ability to consume, the greater the consumption. And the greater the consumption, the greater, of course, must be the production, and consequently, the greater the nation. And he packs a lot into that statement. One, the conflation of soldiers of peace, soldiers of war, settling the continent, manifest destiny. And in that last line, a looking forward to the culture of consumption. It's very interesting, the language that he chooses here. And along with a couple of other things I'm going to mention a little later, he's looking toward the America that will evolve, the dynamic, the rapidly industrializing, dynamic, consumerist, began much earlier than you may think, America of the Gilded Age and afterward. Anyway, the second great bill committed the federal government to the creation of a transcontinental railway from the Missouri River to the Pacific. Again, proposals for such a railroad had been stymied for years by Southerners, who would only agree to a route that would facilitate the westward expansion of slavery, a Southern route. A California representative, whom I'm going to quote in a minute, his name was Timothy Phelps. He was a 49er who found gold, and he turned into a land developer, and he led the debate in the House. He argued that the railroad was first a matter of national security. We're in a war. The Pacific states were isolated and exposed against assault by a foreign power. We're talking about California, Oregon, and Washington, and the inland territories, Nevada, which soon becomes a state. Assault by a foreign power, it sounds unlikely and implausible, but in point of fact, it was a pretty potent argument at a time when intervention in the Civil War by England and France seemed fairly possible. The railroad, Phelps said, offered the only means to speedily dispatch reinforcements from the east, and moreover, it would demonstrate to the European powers that the United States still possessed the determination and resources to simultaneously undertake a spectacular expansion of the nation's infrastructure and to fight off a massive rebellion. So again, the war, the fact that the war is underway infused the entire debate about the railroad. Now, Thaddeus Stevens, who was an ardent, let's get to Stevens here. There we go. There's our man. Stevens was an ardent supporter of the Transcontinental Railroad. He argued that growth in the West's population brought about by homesteading and the railroad would so enrich the country by expanding its agricultural economy and by speeding commercial transportation across the continent, that it would open up vast new Asian markets for American manufacturers from China to India. Private capital was insufficient to shoulder the immense expense involved in building that railroad. So to induce capitalists to invest, the bill granted railroads a strip of land, a right-of-way along the, with many sections per mile along both sides of the track for its entire distance, eventually a total of 127 million acres granted to railroads. It also provided for a government loan to the railroad companies in amounts ranging up to $48,000 a mile. That's a chunk of change in 1862. The government was in effect inventing what's been called hothouse capitalism by nursing private investment and protecting it from risk. I don't, by the way, mean to suggest I think that's a terrible idea. It worked. It worked. In terms of nation building, it actually was it proved to have effects that were not quite foreseen, except by those who were on the receiving end of the money. But the railroad probably would not have been built otherwise. At any rate, by nursing private investment, protecting it from risk, and in the process setting the stage for the wild influence peddling and unslakable feeding at the federal trough that characterized the Gilded Age. So, not surprisingly, businessmen from Wall Street investors to land speculators to the manufacturers of iron rails and spikes saw a bonanza, and it was. But it's important to we can look at those events, the people involved, and the kinds of compromises they chose to make, some of which is quite venal. But we have to remember that Northern support for the project was virtually universal at a time when Americans were beginning to see the nation as a continental empire whose destiny shouldn't be impeded by war or expense, much less by Native Americans whose lands the rails would cross. Now, Ben Wade, I wish there were time to talk to you at length about Wade. There isn't. He's a fascinating individual, senator from Ohio, a ferocious abolitionist, very physically courageous guy. Helped physically, personally stem the route from First Battle of Bull Run. Great story. I'm not going to tell it to you. Okay. At any rate, Ben Wade, speaking on behalf of the railroad bill, expressed the feelings of the vast majority of Americans. He said, "Everything that conspires to build up the Great West, to people it with a thrifty, industrious set of inhabitants, pleases me. I'm glad to lend aid to it anywhere and everywhere." And now, Wade also, in May of '62, introduced in the Senate yet another deceptively modest-sounding bill to provide colleges for the benefit of agriculture and the mechanic arts. This bill would provide every state in the Union with 30,000 acres of public land for each of its representatives and senators in Congress as an endowment for tuition-free agricultural colleges, where students would learn this, I'm quoting, the science of soil chemistry, different types of grains and seeds, techniques of deep plowing and drainage, the use of new farming implements, animal husbandry, the treatment of diseases that affected plants and animals, chemical fertilization, and the philosophy of manures. Okay, I'm not a farmer, I don't know. Anyway, so this was the genesis of what eventually became the nation's state university system. I mean, I presume I don't really have to say what an earth-shaking commitment that was, and how the creation of so many public universities would change education for countless Americans up to our present day. And the fourth bill, which I'll just say a word or two about, was the creation of the Department of Agriculture, which was also treated as a war measure. By helping farmers to improve their agriculture, it would strengthen the Union and help defeat the rebellion. The department explained, Owen Lovejoy, many of you may know his name, he's a radical abolitionist. This would foster scientific research and disseminate the latest knowledge to farmers across the country, enabling them to arrest the decline of the land, improve their crops, and restore tracts that had already become exhausted, bringing it back to its pristine vigor. And, I mean, what these four bills tell you is that the Republican Party in Congress has become a very different kind of animal than pre-war Congresses were. This is a party that wants to change the country. It wants to do things that government never did before. It wants to create programs. The federal government had never been in the business of creating programs before. And you see here the seeds of what, as I said earlier, would become the activist government of the 20th century. There'd be some retrenchment after the war, but it's setting American government on a track that was new, okay? I want to go back to talking about Thaddeus Stevens, but by way of doing that, another subject that rarely is discussed by people writing about the Civil War is how the damn thing was paid for. Now, I'm not going to go into that deeply because it's very complex. I spent an enormous amount of time researching it, and I'll spare you the details. But suffice it to say, other than selling bonds, which was innovative in itself at the beginning of the war, which raised a lot of money, but not enough, because as the war went on, it got more and more and more and more expensive. Somewhere in here, but maybe I don't have it in hand. Anyway, it cost a lot of money to raise a regiment, to arm it, to clothe it, to feed it. A regiment of cavalry cost several multiples more. A battery of artillery, even more and more and more. Men had to be paid, they had to be cared for, and so on. At any rate, so pressed to the wall, the government finally instituted taxes, a lot of taxes, an enormous amount of taxes, including an income tax, which you would think, oh, people must have hated that. But in point of fact, much to my surprise, when I was researching this, I was struck by how frequently both public figures and ordinary people and newspapers are saying, tax is patriotic. We are ready. The whole country is ready. More than this, it is willing, even desirous, to be taxed, heavily taxed, to furnish all the needful means. And that was a constituent writing to William Pitt Fessenden, who is the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, whom I wrote a great deal about. You might as well see his picture. He's up here. William Pitt Fessenden, a Yankee from Maine, who worked hand in glove with Stevens. They're very different men. One operated obviously in the House, the other in the Senate, but they were much of this couldn't have been accomplished without their partnership. Anyway, Thaddeus Stevens, when he introduced a tax plan to the House in March of 1862, said, "Is this tax really necessary?" Then he went on to say, "Crushing the rebellion requires armies and navies. To sustain them, money is necessary, for the soldiers of the Republic must not go unpaid, no matter what it may cost the civilian. Money can only be had through loans, but loans cannot be had unless, at the same time, means be provided for paying punctually the interest." Again, I'm not going to dwell on this, but this is immensely significant that these debates and these conversations are even taking place. The war wasn't only fought because because of the profound idealism and patriotism that welled up in ordinary men willing to fight, whether it be to reunite the Union, to save the Union, or to end slavery. It required people who needed to solve these problems, these practical problems. And this is government in action. And frankly, I'm shocked and dismayed by the popular contempt in which some parts of American society seem to want to hold government today. They obviously don't know what government does. They don't know how it works. Government is hard work. You hire people to solve problems that people basically don't know how to solve, and that require things like raising money, which isn't very romantic. It's not exciting soapbox oratory, but it had to be done. And the war was won, and the the nation was saved as much by raising taxes and raising money by other means as it was by courageous soldiers fighting on battlefields, because Congress had their backs. Anyway. Okay. Anyway, like the broadening assault on slavery, which I'll get to in a second, the tax plans represented yet another front in the Republicans' steady march toward more effective and centralized government. And there was opposition in Congress. It was hard fought, actually. Stevens didn't command big majorities on bills of this type. But the New York Herald, which by and large didn't like Stevens, said, Stevens was obliged to crack the parliamentary whip vigorously over the team to keep them in the traces. And Stevens's bullying was rewarded when, one day after the Battle of Shiloh, the bill that I was referring to, was passed. And maybe I should say, since you already know, Stevens wasn't the Speaker of the House. So what was he? There really were no majority and minority leaders in those days. Debates had tended to have ad hoc leaders. Thaddeus Stevens served as a de facto Republican majority leader through the war without the title. He was chairman, in fact, also of the Ways and Means Committee, which, as you know, is the Congress's purse strings. If it can't get through the Ways and Means Committee, it don't happen. In fact, no member of Congress is more central to virtually every pivotal piece of wartime legislation than Thaddeus Stevens. Not only was he the most fiery orator in the House and one of the most effective radicals in Congress, he was also, and this is an incredible combination, a master of parliamentary strategy. He knew how to make things happen on the floor. His contemporary, Charles Sumner, a senator from Massachusetts, they were like-minded in their values, except Sumner was remarkably ineffective on the floor. He wasn't a very good politician. I mean, his language is wonderful, his heart was always in the right place, but nobody paid much attention to him in Congress because he wasn't very good at the mechanics. Stevens was brilliant at the mechanics. Of course, people found him often pretty abrasive. Didn't bother him at all. And for a man already in his 70s, born in 1792, and in pretty bad health, he was a prodigiously hard worker. And from the beginning, he saw more clearly than the great majority of his colleagues how savage the war was going to be. He had no illusions, unlike many others who thought it would be over in 3 months or it'd be over in 2 years. And he also saw what it would take to win it. And he knew that it would require a Herculean political effort and that it would upend prejudices of all kinds and that it would test the Constitution. As early as 1861, when conservatives, including Unionists, were bent on preserving slavery because it was protected by the Constitution, Stevens challenged them. I'm quoting, "Who says the Constitution must come in bar of our actions? It's an absurdity. When a country is at open war with an enemy, you have a right to use every means which will weaken them. The South would have to feel pain if their whole country must be laid waste and made a desert in order to save this Union from destruction. So let it be." That's vintage Thad Stevens right there. And making a pretty problematic statement about the Constitution. But on the other side of the ledger, he knew it was going to be extremely difficult to win the war. And he dismissed hand-wringing over constitutional concerns that he felt inhibited the war effort. And during one debate over war powers, and there were many debates over what government could actually do, Stevens said, "You cannot justify 9 out of 10 acts here if you consider the Constitution a valid and binding instrument." But the Constitution was a total nullity in the seceded states, he said, and the war must be carried on upon principles wholly independent of it. And one of the milder examples he cited was the admission of West Virginia in 1863, for which there was absolutely no provision in the Constitution, but it got admitted anyway, because it would add another free state to the Union. And just after the Battle of Bull Run, long before Lincoln and most of his fellow congressmen, Stevens called for both emancipation and arming the slaves. I'm quoting, "I, for one, shall be ready to go for it. I, for one, shall be ready to go for it. Let it horrify anyone else." He predicted that within 2 years, former slaves would be marching south in federal uniforms, and he was just about precisely right. He argued that the South's economy, wartime economy, also depended on the sweat of slaves, and by freeing white men for the Confederate Army, slavery gave the South a huge advantage. Whenever a Union soldier was a man subtracted from the North's factories and farms. Stevens said, "Prejudice may be shocked, weak minds startled, weak nerves may tremble, but they must hear and adopt it. Those who now furnish the means of war are but the natural enemies of slaveholders, and they must be made our allies. Universal emancipation must be proclaimed to all." Slave owners, he said, might wail about a servile insurrection, but what was more to be feared, he demanded, a rebellion of slaves fighting for their freedom, or a rebellion of freemen fighting to murder the nation. It's incredible. I mean, what oratory, you know. He said, "You send forth your sons and brothers to shoot and saber and bayonet the insurgents, but you hesitate to break the bonds of their slaves to reach the same end?" And okay, there was a debate. I'm going to compress this a bit. I mean, one of many debates, but over whether or not, not just to free enslaved people, but whether to arm formerly enslaved men. And a Kentucky unionist, mind you, pro-slavery unionist, said on the floor of the House, "Why, what's the point? They're uncivilized and they're all cowards, and one shot of a cannon would disperse 30,000 of them anyway." In other words, what do we need black troops for? Stevens responded, and I'm following the description of a journalist who observed this. Stevens slowly unfolded himself from his desk, rising by degrees as a telescope is pulled out, his heavy toupee falling over his brow and his cold little eyes bristling with anger. And he said, "Why then object to them as a savage and barbarous race if one gun will disperse an army of them?" He sarcastically pointed out that the Portuguese, French, Dutch, British, and even patriots during the American Revolution had all armed African Americans. Then he said, "I am for sending the army through the whole slave population of the South and asking them to come from their masters, to take the weapons which we furnish, and to join us in this war of freedom against traitors and rebels. I do not view it as an abolition or an emancipation question. I view it as the means, and the only means, of putting down this rebellion." And there's more going on here than what you get on the surface. Stevens could have argued for emancipation and for the recruitment of black troops purely as a pragmatic war measure, which he did in the words that I just quoted. But he also attacked white racism head on, and he challenged Congress and implicitly all Americans to transcend it. Racism, he implied, lay at the nation's very core. Even supposing that the army could be rebuilt with white volunteers alone, he asked, "Is that any argument against employing blacks?" To those who claimed that Yankee soldiers would never fight alongside blacks, Stevens replied, "If there were really soldiers who would throw down their weapons rather than fight with blacks, then, quote, In God's name, let them go. They are rebels at heart and ought to be in the Confederate Army rather than ours. He went on to condemn narrow and selfish patriotism, quote, which embraces only one's own race and leaves the other numerous races of mankind to bondage and misery. So, this is vintage Stevens. And among even the radical Republicans of his own time, I think Stevens stands not alone. There were people. Ben Wade was another, and there were other men whose names I haven't mentioned here. Who saw the America that we all live in. It's not an America without struggle, heaven knows, but they saw the America that we have today. Certainly, they didn't think it was going to be simple. They didn't think it was all going to be happy. They knew it was going to be difficult. The future was going to be difficult. But they saw what it would be, what it could be, and they saw Lincoln in his own unique way spoke about the better angels of our nature. And Stevens wouldn't use terminology like that. He was, insofar as he had any religion, it was pretty thin. So he wouldn't have used that kind of language. But he was speaking to the same thing that he knew existed within the better part of Americans. Anyway, so what I've been talking about here with Stevens, Clement Vallandigham, I'm not going to talk about him, right? Copperhead's one of them is Vallandigham. Lincoln, whom I'm just going to explain why I chose this as a Lincoln picture. I'm not going to dwell on it, but this was a picture taken not long before he was elected in 1860. And I wanted Lincoln without the beard to see how you would remember, if you were living in wartime, you would remember this Lincoln. You may not have seen the photograph, but you would have seen it in engravings in the newspapers and so on. And it gives us, in that face, everything that we know Lincoln to be as a man and a political figure. But I think we see him more as maybe Americans rather than Father Abraham, which has become the icon ever since. Okay, so I'm kind of going to wrap up here, but I want to. What I've been saying about Thaddeus Stevens and the recruitment of black troops and so on, and emancipation, looks forward to what is happening, to the transformation that's already taking place, not just in Congress, but in the United States, a country saturated with racism, in the North, by the way. The South is what it was, but saturated with racism, where abolitionists were treated as the most, as almost repugnant, marginalized political people. Not very long before the war, winds up fighting a war that includes emancipation. It doesn't end racism, obviously, but emancipation does become a war measure. And Stevens, because of his health, did not lead the floor debate for the 13th Amendment. He handed it over to an Ohio congressman named James Ashley, who was much younger. And he hauled him, this is in January 65, he hauled himself into the chamber, and you have this sense, I mean I do anyway, of almost dragging his body onto the floor. He was in just such bad shape. But he delivered one of the most heartfelt speeches and one of the most moving of the entire debate. And it had the ring, as it in fact was, a valedictory, the words of an old man who sensed that his body was about to fail him. He'd lived 3 more years, though. But he was well aware that what was taking place represented the moral climax of his political life. And I'm going to quote him. When 15 years ago I was first honored with a seat in this body, it was dangerous to talk against this institution, slavery, a danger which gentlemen now here will never be able to appreciate. And yet I did not hesitate in the midst of Bowie knives and revolvers and howling demons upon the other side of the house. He's not exaggerating, by the way. Men went armed into Congress before the war. I did not hesitate to stand here and denounce this infamous institution in language which possibly now, on looking at it, I might deem intemperate, but which I then deemed necessary to rouse the public attention and cast odium upon the worst institution on earth, one which is a disgrace to man and would be an annoyance to the infernal spirits. And, of course, the 13th Amendment passes. Slavery as an institution ends. It takes 3 more years to pass the 14th Amendment. Stevens is a guiding spirit, a father of the 14th Amendment. Although the debate by 68 was carried on primarily by other people. But what the 14th Amendment gave, ensuring that African Americans, former slaves, would actually be citizens of the United States, and not only in the southern states. There were northern states which basically restricted the civil rights of African Americans as well. Not every state, it varied. But as we know today, I mean, it's a transformative keystone measure of the values of the better part of our country today. We're still fighting over it, obviously. And the 15th Amendment passed in 1870, 2 years after Stevens's death. Stevens had been calling for the enfranchisement of African Americans for years. And he is, in a sense, also a father of the 15th Amendment. So, I'll give you this picture again. I think, to us today, at least to many people, Congress may seem needlessly quarrelsome and inefficient, but its workings are really just the sound of the multitude of American voices distilled to 535 representatives and senators. And small r Republican politics, the politics of a republic, is always messy, and the founders knew it. They fought a revolution. And I want to emphasize this because I think this is something Americans really have forgotten, that the founders fought a revolution not to tame politics and make everything calm and predictable, much less to install a dictator, which they feared in their bones, but to put politics, with all its frustrating turbulence, into government. They wanted it. They knew it had to be turbulent if it was going to be democratic, if it was and representative. They didn't like the word democracy at that time, but okay. And as William Pitt Fessenden, whose picture I gave you a while ago, the Maine senator, as he once put it, I would not have perfect quiet always. In a republic especially, you never find quiet except under a tyranny. We should remember it. And so Stevens, who, as you gather, is really my favorite person in the book that I wrote here, although it's peopled with a great many people. It's not a bio of Stevens, of which there were several excellent ones. But Stevens was a man who made a lot of noise, and good trouble, as has been said much more recently. And by doing that, he helped make the America that we live in today a far better place than would have been if he'd never lived. John Lewis was who I was trying to think of. Thaddeus Stevens made a lot of good trouble, and he saw the nation that we could evolve into. And I think, as Professor Pinsker said earlier, I think he was one of the most consequential political figures in American history. and certainly in congressional history. And I am thrilled that, as all of you may well know, the Stevens House and Lydia Hamilton Smith House in Lancaster is next year about to become a museum dedicated to a history center and museum dedicated to Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith and to his achievements and the politics and society of the world that he and they lived in. And this is a national quality project. I've been privileged to have a little bit of input into what's being done over there. It is a fabulous project. Be first in line when it opens next year, and tell your friends, because it's going to help put Thaddeus Stevens back on the map again. Thank you, and I think we have time for a few questions. Matt?
First round. Okay. We're going to do 15 minutes of Q&A if there are questions. Sarah and Henry are going to take microphones around. Henry, you can go over this side. Raise your hand and then just wait for them to bring the microphone to you. I'd be grateful if students wanted to ask some of the first questions, but I'll take questions from students of all ages. There's Jack from our Knowledge for Freedom seminar.
Hi, thank you for that speech. I think I learned a lot. How did Congress and the president, even though they're the same party, how did they interact during the war? Like, did they work together a lot, or did they keep each other in line?
Look, as always in the United States, as always, there's a stress between the executive and the legislative. As I think I said, more or less, Stevens and the radicals of the Republican Party were ahead of Lincoln on many issues. Okay, certainly more farsighted in seeing how difficult the war would be, and certainly in the necessity of taking certain radical steps. Now, nothing, by the way, I say should be heard as trying to shrink Lincoln in any way. Lincoln deserves all the attention he's had as a political figure. I mean, certainly, like every other historian I know, regard him as the best president the country's ever had. And what I'm interested in doing here is restoring a balance and understanding what the politics of the war was. Okay, I mean, Lincoln was often frustrated with the radicals. Really frustrated. I don't know how much of a swearing man Lincoln was, but I bet he sometimes got pretty blue in his language when he was talking about some of the people I've been talking about here. Lincoln is a. I'm really. You were the man, really, Matt Pinsker, to be talking about this aspect of Lincoln. He was a political animal too. You know, he's become a kind of an icon. Okay, but he was a politician after all. He was a sharp politician. He was a sharp-elbowed politician, and he was a lot sharper than even many Republicans thought he was when he came into office. I mean, the stress between the executive and the legislative was continuous throughout the war, but it can also be said that in some respects, Lincoln let Congress take the heat for where he was prepared to go eventually.
We have a question over here. There we go. Oscar.
Thank you for the speech. I'm just wondering how a policy like the Transcontinental Railroad reflected on like the troops or generals or something, like how Congress was spending money on something that wasn't maybe fighting the war, and how that relationship was.
Okay, I didn't hear you 100% clearly, but I think what you were asking was what was Congress's role in dealing with the military, basically, and selecting generals, or is it different?
Something like that, but more how Congress was spending money on things besides the military effort, how that reflected on sort of how the opinion of the military was on that, like if they were bitter or something like that.
Oh, well, Yeah, I've got it. Well, okay, that's a really good question, okay? Now, bear in mind that Congress spared no effort to raise money for the military. I mean, first and foremost, the war had to be won. Soldiers had to be supplied, had to be recruited, paid, fed, and they had to fight, okay? So it wasn't as if Congress was somehow picking the pockets of the military in order to build a railroad. They raised more money. Now, there was controversy over the means by which money was raised. For example, the gigantic giveaways to the railroads. As I said before, I've come to the conclusion that it was a risk that, in the context of the time, was probably worth taking, but there was an awful lot of corruption involved and an awful lot of money that went into the pockets of already very, very, very wealthy railroad people. That's true. But it wasn't something that compromised the war effort. It was seen as part of the war effort. Now, the government borrowed a prodigious amount of money. I mean, this money didn't just, rain from the sky. Even taxes weren't adequate. There was an enormous amount of borrowing, and government carried a huge debt, which lasted for years after the war. So, that became in itself very controversial as time went on, and that had a political impact. I mean, in today's debates, the government was deep in deficit, okay, to put it in modern terms. I mean, it got paid. It will always get paid if you believe that does have to be paid. It's a complicated question, but it didn't damage the war, the army in the field.
Why don't we go there, and then Henry, you can go over there.
Hello, Mr. Bordewich.
Also a student from the program.
Yeah, my name is Natalia Clone Rosario. My question is about how you said that the 37th and 38th Congress were among the most efficient in history, yet they were ever clashing. So my question is, how do you think that today we see a very clashing legislature? What changes could be made to a modern Congress to promote efficiency while still representing the multitude of American voices?
Okay.
You have an hour and a half. Go ahead.
That's all? Okay, but I think the word that I used, unless I misspoke, was effective. Effective. Government's never efficient. No, by its nature. Nor is business efficient, by the way. That's a myth. That's a myth that, we're just accustomed to talking in these terms. I said effective. And the reason these few Congresses that I cited were so effective was primarily because one party had a gigantic majority, and that's not the case today. I mean, the country is polarized. I mean, I'm stating what everybody knows. It's polarized, and the difference between parties, 51%, 49, 52, 48, and whenever the country is that polarized, and it's not the only time it's ever been, government isn't effective. Forget efficiency. Isn't very effective. That said, on other than real hot button, morally fraught issues, the previous two Congresses before this one were actually regarded as fairly efficient, okay? Not on the issues that have people very agitated. I mean, what's going to happen in the next few years, I don't dare say. But there are various proposals made for altering the structure of Congress. I mean, the one radical distortion that exists today that's gotten consistently worse over time is the ill representation in the Senate, which gets worse and worse and worse all the time. 2 senators from California, 2 senators from Wyoming. You know, Wyoming has, what, 300,000 people? California, I don't know how many, tens of millions. It has made the Senate, it has skewed power in the Senate. Often in American history, power has been skewed in ways that is unfair until emancipation. The slave states got to count 3/4 of the enslaved population, and they had representation. Not the slaves didn't have representation, but as you know, of course, they had that many more congressmen. This went on until the 1860s. So these imbalances are not unique to our moment, but nobody on earth will choose to relinquish power just to be nice. So the way the Senate works is written in the Constitution, and there was no way. You know, there's been talk of a new constitutional convention. Think who would control it before you think that's a great idea. I mean, wherever you are on the spectrum, okay. I mean, I have my own opinions, but you know, people who want a new constitutional convention think it will tend to represent them. Don't think about it. It won't.
All right, we have a question over here.
Hi, thank you. What do you know about Thaddeus Stevens' view of Abraham Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus, or like what was the relationship between Congress and the executive about that subject? I don't know a lot about it. I don't know if Congress had anything to do with those sort of laws and kind of human rights that were kind of, you know, supported in America during that time. What was it seems like Thaddeus Stevens had a lot of personal opinions about rights, especially to do with African Americans at this time. What was his opinion of that?
Okay, Stevens supported any war measure that would help advance Union victory. Okay, Stevens. There was a lot of debate over habeas corpus. It was extremely fraught. There were many, even Republicans, who did not like the suspension of habeas corpus, and it took, I believe, 2 years. Two years to gain a majority for support of the president's policy on habeas corpus. Essentially, it was a standoff, and there was a tacit, well, it wasn't so tacit, an agreement to just not vote on it. Okay, the same issue was very significant during Ulysses Grant's presidency, which I wrote about at great length in another book.
Available for sale. Credit cards accepted.
Or just look over somebody else's shoulder. I don't know. I mean, it's a deep question. It's a deep question, and you know, there were eloquent and persuasive arguments made in both directions. But those who felt that it was an essential war measure won the argument.
All right, we have a few minutes left. We'll take a couple of questions if we can fit them in, and then Fergus will be downstairs in the lobby, and you can ask him more questions if you have them. Lagim? I'm getting a lot of student questions. If there's a grown-up who wants the last question, Al Mackey, get that hand up, and we'll let you go.
Thank you so much for the speech. So how do you think that public opinion, particularly in the North during the time of the Civil War and sort of the years leading up to it, influenced a lot of the key decisions that were, you know, made in terms of policy in Congress?
Wow. Okay, big question. It's very good. It's very good. Very few members of Congress, very few elected officials in any time are willing to risk defying their voters. Okay, a remarkable example in recent times is Liz Cheney. You know, really remarkable but and a kind of an exception that proves the rule. People who do that get diselected, you know, and that was certainly true then as well. Public opinion was not any one thing. Of course, there were a lot of public opinions, and there was no polling. Didn't exist. But on the other hand, Americans were very political. They were very self-consciously political, much more so than today. Bear in mind, there was no other entertainment, really. You know, no sport, no national sports, no television, or radio, no internet. So, you know, politics was kind of all that stuff for people. So people were really engaged and had opinions, okay. Lincoln, for one, understood that in 1861, 1862, and 1863, there was not sufficient public support for emancipation for him to declare it by proclamation. Okay, that's an example, and that's where he differed, say, from Stevens. Stevens, on the other hand, very interesting. Here he's one of the most radical men in Congress, but he represents, on the whole, a fairly conservative district, you know, but is such an effective congressman in other ways that he gets reelected. Okay, so it's not easy to answer that in one way, except to say that it took time to shift public opinion sufficiently. Also to accept the raising of black troops for the war, which was absolutely inconceivable in 1861, but in 1863, recruitment is dynamic.
Okay, last question. All right, you know what, Al? You're going to have to ask in person. Ava Frederick gets to ask. I'm sorry.
If there was like one lesson you would want politicians of today to take from this, what would it be?
That's a good closing question, but you got to keep it short.
Oh, geez, man. Well, I will say that it's what I closed with, that politics is always messy. I mean, maybe I was speaking more to the public with that, what I would like the public to draw from it than members. But I live in Washington. I live down the street from the U.S. Capitol. I go to my building, I see it up there, and my wife spent a very large piece of her professional career working in the Senate, pretty near the center of it, actually. So that there's a fundamental difference between politicians. That's not a bad word in my vocabulary, by the way. We need politicians. It's just a descriptor. You know, there are politicians who make their careers, and you know who they are, essentially on a soapbox, doing performative politics and mouthing off. And frankly, they exist in both parties, although maybe in greater abundance in one than the other, I don't know. And those who do the job, you know, that I think Thaddeus Stevens was a great orator, but he did the job. And I said, he did the job. He did the hard work, the unglamorous work. And and there are people in both parties like this too. Some of them whom politically I don't care for a bit, but are really, really good at the parliamentary job. And they therefore represent, they are the mainstays of our democratic institutions and Republican institutions. And in the present time, when those seem to be under threat from, you know where, it's more urgent than ever that the institutions work, and that the people who do the work to make those institutions function are the people we should look toward for leadership.
All right, well, I think we can agree that Fergus did the job. he's going to be downstairs if anybody wants to ask a question or get a book signed. Henry will be here helping take pictures in front of the lectern if anybody wants them. Thank you for coming tonight.
Okay?
Yeah, excellent. Listen, let's get you down.
Yeah, okay.